I don't think President Trump is inviting Zelenskyy over for Christmas dinner, but I do think he understands Zelensky's a winner. We all know President Trump likes to back winners, and slowly but surely the truth is breaking through the kind of Russian disinformation campaign that surrounds the president, telling him that Russia is winning. General Borisov may be able to trick Vladimir Putin into thinking they're making progress, but he shouldn't be able to trick the President of the United States, who has the U.S. intelligence community telling him very directly that Ukraine holds the cards, that Ukraine is in the stronger position, that as long as Ukraine doesn't do anything, illogical, they are not going to lose. Their military resilience is too strong to lose on the ground. If I was Russia, I would be concerned. The summit tried to address Ukraine's greatest shortfall, air defense interceptors. There was discussion of, can we work together to protect the air defense of Ukraine? These are things you haven't heard from the United States ever, under Biden or Trump.
Hello and welcome to Independence Avenue Media. I'm Kartul Sharashenicen. Today we are joined by Admiral Mark Montgomery, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We'll be discussing the outcomes of the NATO Summit. Admiral Montgomery, first of all, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. President Trump described the NATO Summit as tremendously successful. Would you agree with that? And was there anything that surprised you about the summit?
Well, I would say it was successful because, first, there's a low bar for summits for being successful. And second, despite a very rocky start where the president, for no apparent reason, just lashed out against his European allies, it then turned into a meaningful discussion, and very specifically on the issue of how the war in Ukraine is going and what's appropriate support to Ukraine. We saw a lot of indications of that, both from the Europeans who continue their aggressive support of Ukraine, and from President Trump, who agreed to several, at least provisionally has agreed to several important steps that will help with the air defense of Ukraine. So that's a big one. But there are also things that happen. I'm still concerned about U.S. force posture in Europe and things like that, which weren't explicitly dealt with, and we could see announcements from the United States in the next few weeks or months that backslide on kind of the good, the kind of good vibrations that might have been there at the very end of the summit. But again, it started out, poorly, but ended strong.
Do you think allies now have more confidence that the United States will stand by its Article 5 commitments if they were ever tested?
So I think that whatever opinion you had of President Trump before the summit and his credibility as an ally, you still hold. There's too much water under the bridge, with the threats in Greenland, the kind of divestment from Ukraine, the force posture moves done without any kind of consultation with the armored brigade combat team in Poland and the Baltics. All that's happened. You can't wish that away. So I think that America's NATO allies would be wise to be concerned about President Trump throughout the rest of his administration.
You just mentioned U.S. troop levels in Europe, and on the flight home from Ankara, President Trump said future troop levels could still depend on issues like Greenland and Iran, although he said he has not made the final decision yet. So does that change how allies should interpret the outcomes of the summit?
Look, there is some truth in President Trump's complaints about European troop level support. When you spend 25 years or 20 years spending less than 2% on defense, you actually can't defend yourself. And, it's hard. NATO's hard. It's not one country. It's 32 countries. So there's inefficiencies in the armies, navies, and air forces when they come together. So with all that put together, the European military commitment, circa 2022 was abysmal. and their ability to generate forces without the United States was negligible, in terms of confronting a peer adversary like Russia. Now, they're doing a lot more, particularly Germany. Obviously, Poland and the Baltic states stepped out first, but those are small militaries, relatively speaking, particularly the Baltic states. But even Poland, when you compare it to, say, Germany or the UK or the French, but Germany has really stepped up. And that's what I think the president needs to do more to acknowledge, is that Germany is taking this leadership position among the European NATO countries. And if they continue that, Europe will be in much better shape and NATO will be in much better shape. But the president can't, he's got to, a U.S. drawdown of our actual forces in Europe or our commitment to provide forces in a surge, which are they're two different things, has got to, can't be an abandonment. It has to be done in an integrated fashion. And I'll get to, the big one is the one where we announced that as part of an overall fight, in a big, in some kind of, real crisis with Russia, the United States is going to provide less forces. And that's because we recognize the authoritarian axis that we're facing, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, are more likely to operate together now. They're showing that in Ukraine. So we can't send most of our submarines, most of our fighter jets, most of our carrier strike groups to Europe in a crisis. We have to split it. Now, this could have been done better. It could have been done in better consultation. It could have been done, with discrete timelines that give the 5 or 7 years Europe needs to get to those positions. Hopefully, coming out of this, the guidance he gives Secretary Hegseth, our Secretary of Defense, is to do this in a more deliberate way. You continue to explain to Europe there'll be less Americans, because this is the truth, whether it's President Trump or a Democratic president or a future Republican president, the U.S. will be providing less forces because of the nature of the axis of authoritarians. Just President Trump and his team, particularly Secretary Hegseth, have not communicated that in an effective way.
Let's talk about the summit declaration. It highlights NATO's commitment to collective defense, describes Russia as a long-term threat, underscores the support for Ukraine and calls for expanding defense production. So what will it take to put those priorities into actions?
So I appreciate all of those. I'll take defense production. Europe does need to increase its defense production. What would be unhelpful or unhealthy is if Europe follows France's lead and tries to to the detriment of the United States companies, that we will not select them. That's not, that would be inappropriate. And it would fly in the face of, for the last 20 years, the United States did maintain a defense industrial base, did sell weapons to Europe. And for Europe to suddenly turn on that would be a mistake. I think the United States military industrial base, though, can't supply all of Europe and all of the United States and all of our Asian partners and our Middle East partners. So I'm excited about German companies growing and becoming more capable, because they are the industrial workhorse of Europe. I'm excited about Polish companies, being able to export more. I think there's there, and same with the Brits and the French and the Italians. I think that and of course Norway has a very aggressive program, but this needs to be done as a partnership, not to the detriment or exemption of any one country. And so in that regards, the offers that happened during the summit for co-production of U.S. weapons in Europe, that's a great one, because that's a great way of acknowledging the U.S. production capacity just isn't there. But the U.S. technology is of value. And I think we'll see the same thing with some of these, with unmanned systems, that U.S. companies co-produce with European partners who have the intellectual property, particularly eventually Ukraine. So I'm excited, if done properly, if done in a punitive way, which is hard when you're involving President Trump, but if done properly, I think there's a great opportunity here for a NATO that can produce sufficient weapons to counter any Russian aggression.
Let me ask you about Moscow's perspective. So, how should the Kremlin read this declaration and the outcome of this summit?
Well, they should be concerned, and I think Putin was immediately fairly threatening. Look, some of the co-production of Patriot by Ukraine is really interesting. It's not. By the way, I hope this doesn't mean Ukraine doesn't continue to try to produce its own air defense interceptor. I'm excited about the idea of Ukraine producing a low-cost, maybe not quite as effective, but still very effective air defense asset, that's not made from the same supply chain as Patriot. Because co-production for Patriot will still be putting a burden on the same supply chain. We don't get rid of that problem. So I'm hoping Ukraine does both. If I was Russia, I would be concerned. The summit tried to address Ukraine's greatest shortfall, air defense interceptors. There was discussion of, can we work together to protect the air defense of Ukraine? These are things you haven't heard from the United States ever under Biden or Trump. At some point, I think we all know President Trump likes to back winners. And slowly but surely, the truth is breaking through the kind of Russian disinformation campaign that surrounds the president, telling him that Russia is winning. Gerasimov may be able to trick, General Gerasimov may be able to trick Vladimir Putin into thinking they're making progress. But he shouldn't be able to trick the president of the United States, who has the U.S. intelligence community telling him very directly that Ukraine holds the cards, that Ukraine is in the stronger position, that as long as Ukraine doesn't do anything, illogical, they are not going to lose. Their military resilience is too strong to lose on the ground. And when that gets through to the president, and he understands that President Zelenskyy holds the cards, not President Putin, you'll see a change in how President Trump approaches both those leaders.
You mentioned the Patriot production decision. So, what do we know about this plan, and what could it mean for Ukraine in both short-term and long-term perspectives?
So, this is a little bit more than when President Trump said maybe Tomahawk missiles, because that was definitely just a maybe. This sounds more solid, but still, there's so many steps to get done. That's why I said Ukraine should still be pushing for its own domestic produced air defense weapon. I think that's more likely to get done first than a co-produced Patriot with the United States. I'm equally happy that we're co-producing Patriots with Germany. There you have a proven industrial base that can attack this pretty quickly. And I believe the Germans would provide, Patriot rounds to Ukraine as part of that production. So both of those efforts in Germany and in Ukraine to co-produce Patriots could eventually produce results. The one in Germany definitely will. As I said, I hope Ukraine continues with an alternative path, because that's a risky path. Building a Patriot's not easy. And the secondary and tertiary supply chains are under stress from U.S. production increases. So I don't know that that's a quick win. But it is it's part of a narrative of support that has to have Vladimir Putin concerned.
Well, President Trump said that yes, producing Patriots is difficult and complex process, but that Ukrainians can do it.
Yeah, I mean, do I think Ukraine can MacGyver together almost everything if they have the intellectual property? You bet. But there's certain parts of a Patriot that are essential and have to be made at a specific factory or set of factories. And that supply chain is under duress as the U.S. is trying to increase its production of Patriots, trying to almost triple it over the next 5 years. Japan's trying to increase theirs, I believe, doubling it. Germany's going to come online doing it, and Ukraine. That's a lot of stress on a supply chain. I just want to be... This is not a question of President Trump's commitment. This is a question of scientific or engineering fact. There are only so many of these things are being produced at a time. So we just have to make sure that we're working hard on all the supply chain. I mean, the good news is in America, we're investing in this supply chain. We're putting government money into improving production capabilities. And the other good news is some of this can be produced indigenously in Ukraine. Some of the parts, not some of the, but many of the parts could be possibly, but not all of them. And so that's my concern. Again, in principle, an excellent thing. As a strategic narrative, a superb thing. As an operational reality, let's hope we can, my number one hope is that Ukraine can somehow get Patriot missiles from Saudi Arabia, who has lots of them, and needs Ukrainian support on ground-based interceptors. My number two hope is they could get more from the United States through Pearl or from Germany through their co-production. And then my next hope would be that Ukrainian domestic production, co-production comes online fast. But we'll have to see.
President Trump's meeting with President Zelenskyy seemed like quite different from some of their previous meetings. Do you think we are seeing the administration take a different approach to Ukraine?
For now, yes. I mean, this is the problem with this administration. It looks, all signals point to an improving relationship. And again, I think this is principally driven by President Trump's desire to support a winner. And I don't think that's going to change. Ukraine's clearly the winner, and I think there's been a breakthrough in kind of as I said, the Russian disinformation campaign, from Tucker Carlson and others that surrounds the president. I think that's broken. But Steve Witkoff's been busy in the Middle East. He's coming back. He has not been a useful interlocutor. I mean, there's places where I could see setbacks, is what I'm telling you. But absolutely, coming out of this summit, the momentum is towards better U.S., European, Ukrainian cooperation. That's clearly critical. And Zelenskyy deserves a lot of credit. He's shown patience. He's shown discipline. Since the bad meeting in February of 2025, he has had a series of, he has tried his utmost to support President Trump, to reach out effectively to President Trump. And that 18-month campaign is paying off. And President Trump now sees Zelenskyy. I don't think President Trump is inviting Zelenskyy over for Christmas dinner, but I do think he understands Zelensky's a winner. And he understands that Ukraine has the military and civil strength to persevere over Russia. And that is the most important thing, is to continue to break the Russian offenses and prevent any Russian movement.
At the meeting with President Zelenskyy, President Trump said the United States will work on some kind of security package for Ukraine, based on what we know today. So, what do you think that package could realistically include?
No. It's hard. There were leaks last fall of what a package could look like that were very aggressive, that included, security guarantees that you don't call them Article 5, but they had a lot of the same, certainly the attributes of a mutual defense treaty. We'll have to see if that's really what the president's willing to do. I will tell you, it would be ironic if that was the end result of this, that Trump brought a mutual defense treaty to this, because that's something we couldn't get out of President Biden, and it's something that would put Putin, into orbit, right? So we'll have to see. There's a lot in that. I will say that the Ukraine still is doing fantastic. They're fighting brilliantly. They're doing well. There's a lot Ukraine needs to do to modernize and de-Sovietize, their Ministry of Defense infrastructures. I don't mean the Ministry of Defense itself, but the judicial systems, the promotion systems, the recruitment systems, the education systems, to bring them in line with Western standards. Very hard to do that in the middle of a war. But those are things that we can work, that can be worked on over the next, year and 2 years, so that as a security agreement comes into picture and comes into frame, Ukraine is the whole picture, the whole product. They have all the different elements. I mean, clearly, Ukraine's defense industrial base is westernizing at a rapid rate, and they have phenomenal intellectual property that could really benefit them. So I'm excited. I mean, look, you can never get Trump has turned on a dime in the past, so you don't want to get overly exuberant. But what you want to do is start thinking about how do we take advantage of each of these agreements or each of these declarations, and how do you keep momentum moving forward on all of them? And I think President Zelensky's done everything he can to make that happen.
Let me ask you about Iran. Iran is also mentioned in the summit declaration, and President Trump criticized allies for not helping when they had the chance, although he later said they now want to help. So with the ceasefire apparently over and the conflict escalating again, so what role do you realistically expect NATO allies to play?
So look, I mean, the president is overly critical of Europe in this way. Look, we did not give warning to Europe. I kind of understand that. I kind of understand that. I think the idea that that they could have kept that secret, and there was an importance to timing, for leadership strikes and everything in Iran, that made it impossible to give them early warning. But there could have been briefings weeks ahead of time that said, look, we're serious about this. Here's what we're thinking of doing, not giving away the timing. And then clearly the minute the strike started, we could have done a more aggressive role of courting allies. Part of this was the hubris of the first few days of the strikes, everything going well, that the president decided diplomatically not to engage the allies. And as a result, there were some initial restrictions on airspace and airfield usage. 90% of that went away rapidly. Spain remained an outlier on that, but 90% of it went away. And he's had the support. Our military's had the support it needs. There's a handful of exceptions to that, but it has the support it needs. I think what you heard in Ankara was more of an agreement about the importance of international law in the Strait of Hormuz, and the idea that forces might be contributed to maintaining that at some future time. Realistically, that's minesweepers. I mean, one of the things that NATO has struggles with is they don't have good navies. When you spend 2% or less on GDP, on defense, 2% or less of your gross domestic product on defense, the military service that suffers, for 25 years, the military service that suffers the most is the Navy, because the Navy is encompassed of large ships or, medium-sized ships. And those are expensive to build and maintain. And so that's what you sacrifice. And you can see it in the Royal Navy. The British Navy is a shadow of its former self. So I don't think we'll see we might see some French or some British support, but it'll be very, very limited versus, say, the 18 destroyers the United States has in the vicinity, to conduct blockade and maritime operations. So we'll have to see what we get out of that. I think that was a good solution for the president, a good solution for Europe. And again, I think throughout the whole process of the summit, the Europeans were disciplined, were supportive of the American positions, and generally did everything right. And the president had a good second day, but his arrival press conference was unhelpful and unnecessary. And the irony is he talked how great Turkey was. Turkey was no special help in the Iran effort. And they've never been a good help against the Iranians. So, the president was even slightly confused about that.
And now there is a talk that the U.S. could lift sanctions on Turkey and allow it back into the F-35 program. So, what is your take on this?
That's correct. So, but to get to the F-35, there's congressional language on this as well, though. So Turkey's probably going to have to give up the S-400. And this is a principal thing to Erdogan. I don't even think they use the S-400. There's rumors that it's still in boxes, so to speak. I don't think it's exactly that, but it's certainly not fielded. But he would have to admit he was wrong to buy it. And Erdogan shares many character traits with Trump. And one of them is he can't admit he made a mistake. So, I feel that this is going to, they may eventually get F-35s, but I don't think it's it's not just yet. Some things have to be done. And in any case, it's a long line for F-35s. And no F-35 is going to get delivered to Turkey while Trump is president. So then you get someone else who gets to interpret the law, as the next president. So we'll see about that. I would not, I wouldn't start buying a Turkish F-35 model, for my child, saying this is coming soon.
And this is my very last question. So before the summit, you laid out several criteria for what would make it a successful summit. So looking back now, how do you think it measured up against those expectations?
So I think the first one, acknowledge the defense spending and still call out the laggards. Well, President Trump called out the laggards, not the way I would have done it, but I think that's a check. And Rutte has a list and he's tracking it and he's doing it. I cannot tell you enough how fortunate the alliance is to have Mark Rutte as the Secretary General right now to work between Trump and the Europeans, and he did a fantastic job on that. Number two is on force posture. I think that's still an open question. Trump says I'm still moving them. Rutte's trying to get a kind of a task force together to make sure it's done in a deliberate way. There are already existing mechanisms for doing that. I hope coming back, that's something Trump is telling Hegseth, do this in a more deliberate fashion. We'll see. But that one is still an open question. Calling Putin out, I think that happened more than I thought. Honestly, acknowledging Ukraine, calling Putin out more than happened. On, I think I had 5 actually. I think on Iran, I think it's about what I expected. Pretty weak tea, but still an acknowledgement of Iran and that Iran's the bad actor in this war. And then finally on the defense industrial base, and there I think it's strong. Lots of discussions of co-production, lots of discussions of buying American weapons, lots of discussions of buying European weapons. Again, Trump may not fully state what I would say, but the United States benefits from Europe having a robust defense industrial base. I get that might not be great for Lockheed Martin or Boeing, but it's good for America because America needs its allies to have the quality defense industrial bases. And a little competition never hurt any of these companies. So overall, good work, but not all 5 were complete.
Well, thank you so much again, Admiral Montgomery. It was a great honor to have you with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.